New rule. If you ever think you're an idiot, remember that I just recorded a 15-minute video without actually recording anything. I pushed the record button thinking it was the record button, and it just took a picture. So, take two. Full disclosure, I was able to retrieve some of the data that I said that I had lost as far as rants that I did while driving. The audio was so trashy that I didn't feel right actually depositing it. So I took some notes, and I'm going to go off of those notes as I'm doing this rant. It's a rant that I can do. I've done multiple times now, with and without help. So I have the notes there. I'm probably not really going to need them, especially since I literally just finished recording this without actually recording anything. But I'm going to be looking at some notes, so it's not a pure rant. It's a dirty rant that has been done repeatedly because I'm an idiot. I will own that. Yeah. So what I just talked about and what I'm about to talk about again is I mentioned before that science fiction and fantasy are different, but my perception of them and my conception of them is different than what most people think of. Most people kind of think of science fiction and fantasy as separate settings, right? So a science fiction setting is futuristic, high-tech, that sort of thing. Fantasy is, magical and a lot of high fantasy tends to be medieval or within that time period. There are obviously some gray areas in settings or overlap in settings, like the punks. Cyberpunk is a clear sci-fi looking setting. It's futuristic. Everything is computers and digital and whatnot. Steampunk, on the other hand, is neo-Victorian and, looks closer to that fantasy setting. And crystal punk or mana punk or, whatever they're calling that one now, is a more magically inclined steampunk. And those kind of blur the lines between science fiction and fantasy settings. I'm not worried about the setting so much as the genre or like the foundational purpose of content or content of purpose. Fantasy is a more morally based story. The hero has a goal, a purpose, a quest, something that drives them. And it's a very clear-cut goal. The good guy has to go out and stop the bad guy, destroy the evil thing, that sort of thing. It's very often not as deep a plot because it is able to be so direct, Sci-fi, on the other hand, is more philosophical, more morally gray. There may still be a good guys and bad guys type story going on, but it's less about the, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, as why one side is one way and the other side is the other. Consequences are explored, and, even in victory, there is a taint to the victory. It's not 100%, we won. It's more of a well, we won, but you'll still get that sometimes in some fantasy, but more so in sci-fi. A perfect example of the philosophy end of things is the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek, right? Star Trek is very much a science fiction series. The setting is right, and on top of that, it's all about determining what to do in a situation. What's the right thing to do. And even the characters that are relatively cardboard, Captain Kirk, for example, who is very much the cowboy who, does what's right, regardless of the consequences, still explores the ideas of why what he's doing is right. For example, the Prime Directive is all about non-interference with a non-spacefaring species. If they find a planet where there is a sentient race that has not developed spacefaring, the Prime Directive states that you are supposed to stay away from them until they develop their own technological advancement. And there are multiple times where the directive is violated because, one, it's difficult. Two, there's always an excuse to interfere, And the reason is the important part in that situation. Why are they interfering? Why are they doing what they're doing? And of course, the Prime Directive is an extension, a borrowing from something earlier, from Olaf Stapleton's Star Maker, where they had it as non-utopian species were left to their own devices until they reached a point of utopia, which, utopia is kind of a complicated concept in and of itself, and the Prime Directive, as explained, is a little bit less cagey about that. Star Wars is more fantasy based. At the end of the day, the Jedi are space wizards, and it's very much a moral black and white story. There are good guys, there are bad guys. We know who's on what side. And that's what makes it fantasy, as far as I'm concerned. There's no chance that the Sith are actually the good guys. They are painted in a way that being Sith means that you are the bad guy. That said, there are some things that appear morally gray within Star Wars. I'm talking strictly the original trilogy and even the prequel trilogy, not the extended universe stuff, because Star Wars has had almost 60 years of production at this point. They've had time to expand to the point where they have a lot of philosophy added in. But the original trilogy and even the prequel trilogy are very linear in that, it's good guys and bad guys. Where there is moral grayness, or what appears to be moral grayness, it's not really what you're seeing. A lot of people think of, Han Solo, the scoundrel, as morally gray. That's kind of true. It's probably better to say that he's amoral, meaning he lacks morality. It's not that he doesn't recognize morality. He knows what's right. He knows what's wrong. He doesn't care. He does what's convenient. in a lot of ways. And when he does decide in the end, he weighs in on the side of good. And there's no, shading of that. He does the right thing or he does nothing for the most part. You can argue over, whether conning someone in a card game is moral or not, but, saving a slave is a morally positive thing according to our societal mores. And even like Darth Vader switches sides. There's no real pondering of whether or not he was on the right side. It was, he knew he was the bad guy, but he thought that being, evil was the right thing to be. And then when he switches sides, he joins good without really any moral quandary or anything like that we see. We just see him flip sides to save his son and kill his master. That's not so morally gray. That's not really an exploration of the morality of things. It's just someone seeing what's right, seeing what's wrong, and choosing one or the other. And I mean, that's fantasy story candy. It's what fantasy stories are all about. You get the good guys, you get the bad guys, and you find out who wins. Usually the good guys win, because it's usually a story where the main characters are the good guys. Not always. Sometimes the bad guy's the main character, and sometimes the bad guy wins. But fantasy stories generally follow the hero's story arc, or the Bildungsroman arc, where it's a very clear, there's an inciting incident where everything starts, and then the story builds and builds and builds and builds, hits a climax, and then it ends. And, all of the confrontations follow that hero's journey, where the hero goes out and does things because they're the right thing to do. The Bildungsroman, Bildungsroman is the kind of development of a child, the adventure of a child learning who they are. Think Harry Potter. Versus, the classic hero's journey is like Jason and the Argonauts. But the Bildungsroman is basically a hero's journey where the main character learns what is right and wrong. Not so much the why, but the what. Still sticking to the black and white, with very little gray aspect of a fantasy story. Voldemort's the bad guy. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that, right? Another thing to look at is that if something that could be morally challenging shows up, or philosophically challenging shows up, a fantasy story will often just hand wave it away and ignore it. Whereas a sci-fi story will get philosophical about it and will dig into it a bit. Good example of that, again, I'm hammering in the Star Wars because everybody knows the story. Before they find out they're siblings, Luke and Leia kiss. And it's pretty obvious that Luke has a thing for Leia early on. That's bordering on incest if it's not directly incestuous. They never consummated anything, but they were thinking about it. Luke was, absolutely. Leia, probably, in that, while she's definitely her prime drive throughout the stories is overthrowing the Empire and returning the rebels to power so that the Republic can return, sort of thing. And Star Wars doesn't touch on the fact that they bounced off of incest pretty hard there. In a sci-fi story, they would have explored it some. An example of that is Time Enough for Love by Robert Heinlein. And the basic story of that, it's a Shahrazad journey, or a Shahrazad tale, where an immortal man wants to die, and his descendants won't let him, and they try and find a way to get him interested in living again. And while they are exploring that idea, he's telling them stories about his past and, the growth of the world from, when he was born during, between the two world wars, up to the point where they are in the story, thousands of years in the future, where humanity has spread out amongst the stars. And, one of the kind of side aspects of it is the main character, Lazarus Long, is the ancestor of most all of the other characters that are interacted with in the present. He's the great-great-great-great-grandfather of most of the characters. One character's great-grandmother was his wife. One of them is 6 times removed, whatever. And some of the things that are asked, questions that are asked have to do with incest. Is it incest to sleep with someone 9 generations descended from you? Not your grandchild, not your great-grandchild, but your great-great-great-grandchild. Is that still incest? Because they are your grandchild, 6 times removed. If it is, does it matter? Especially they're in a futuristic setting where genetic defects have been weeded out. The big scientific issue with incest, and likely the origin of the moral aspect of it in pre-scientific society, is that incest tends to compound genetic abnormalities. Diseases become more common, things like that. If those genetic abnormalities don't exist, is incest acceptable? If you're not going to give diseases to your children or grandchildren, you're not going to increase the risk of disease in them. Is it wrong to sleep with a sibling, a child, a grandchild, a great-grandchild, a 6 times cousin, plus, niece, uncle, whatever? That was incoherent, whatever. But the idea stands, if there is no scientific issue, there's no disease, chance of disease, is the social mores still valid? And that's not the primary focus of the book or anything, but it's something that's actually explored in the book, to the point where they clone Lazarus Long and make a female clone of him, or twin clones of him as females. And they talk about, they are genetically him, minus the Y chromosome. Is that incest? Or, they jokingly mention, could it just be masturbation? It's because I'm focusing on this one aspect, it sounds like that's what the story is about. It's not. It's just one thing that gets focused on in a book that's like 35 hours as an audiobook, you know? And this spends maybe a few hours throughout the book talking about it, you know, referencing it. But yeah, that's the difference between science fiction and fantasy in that scenario. There's a lot of overlap, kind of a blurring between science fiction and fantasy in content of purpose as well. Superman's a fantastic example of this, because while it's, you know, Superman coming to save the day, protect people, blah, 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 and, you know, especially the old stories and the newest stories, most of it is Superman's the good guy, and he's just here to do good, and his character is almost boring in that aspect. You know, he will do the right thing no matter what. But, you know, the original Superman comics came out in the mid-20s, 100 years ago. And there has been a lot of time to explore everything about him over that time, including, you know, Superman is powerful enough that he can literally fly back in time by spinning around the planet counterclockwise, according to a couple of odd comics. He's powerful enough that in one story, you know, he hears a help whistle from another galaxy away and gets there inside of a minute. You know, he is God level powerful and is obviously right there. Why doesn't he just stop all war? Why doesn't he, you know, prevent all crime? Blah, blah, blah. And they actually explore, like, if he knows what's best for people, if he will always do what is right, why doesn't he maintain people, keep them, so that they are all forced to do what's right, and he creates a utopia? Well, you know, free choice is an important aspect, and it's something that he protects and defends. You know, the villains must be stopped because they are, in the end, preventing others from being able to exercise their free choice. But they have to have the choice to do that in order to be human. It's an interesting exploration. But that's Superman, you know, and there have been other, like, philosophical aspects, like, what does someone with the power of a god actually want in life? That's one of the saddest story arcs for Superman, actually, because they put a magical flower in him that puts him into a coma where he basically lives out his days in his perfected world inside of his own head. Like, all of his hopes and dreams are fulfilled. And they show what's going on in Superman's head, and he's literally just a normal man with a wife and a kid and a dog, and you know, just perfectly normal within his society. No phenomenal power, no responsibility for the fate of the world, just a normal, simple man. It's the one thing he can't have, and it's the one thing he wants. You know, so even though there is that fantasy level of, you know, good versus evil all the time in Superman stories, you know, he's always the good guy, he always does the right thing, and there's no question about who is right and who is wrong in most of his stories. There are those stories where he does philosophize, or where the writer philosophizes around Superman. Another story in the same vein that kind of bridges the sci-fi fantasy barrier is the Chronicles of Jonathan Tibbs, where the main character is given this alien technology that gives him superpowers that allow him to protect the world from an invading alien group, where the invaders show up one at a time and just kill indiscriminately until they're stopped by him. Yeah, the series is called The Chronicles of Jonathan Tibbs. The first book is called The Never Hero, because he finds out shortly after having performed his first fight that if he kills the invading alien and destroys the device they used to get to Earth, he wakes up just before his device was activated, giving him the super strength to stop the invading alien, and all of the horrible things that alien did on the planet never happened. He's the only one who remembers anything about it having ever happened. Which is an interesting concept. And also kind of excuse me, dangerous conceptually, in that it or not dangerous, but interesting conceptually, in that it begs an immediate question. Defending the world against an alien invader is clearly a moral thing, right? It's the good guy protecting the bad guys. But is a hero when no one remembers it but him? Is it wrong to keep a secret when there is no way to prove what would be needed in order to reveal that truth? And, if you're the only one who knows a secret this big, what is the burden of that? And The Never Hero and its sequels all have 3 layers to them that explore the same concept from different angles, enforcing the sci-fi aspect of it over the straight fantasy good guy fights bad guys, stops bad guys from doing bad things part of the story. Because it's very much a Bildungsroman story about, a college student learning who he is and becoming a hero, while he is exploring the why of what's going on. And the story is told in 3 layers. The first layer being Tibbs, the main character, fighting the aliens, and Tibbs preparing himself physically for the aliens, and everything going on kind of within that sphere. Then there's a lower sphere where he is learning about what it is to be a hero, consuming pop culture stories in order to learn how to be a hero, because it was something he had never been interested in. So he's learning from his roommates about what it takes to be a hero, and the aspects of being a hero. Mostly his roommates are other college students that are majoring in like writing. And so they teach him about what it is to be a badass, what it is to be a hero, by showing him like classic 80s movies and talking about them and explaining why these stories work, why they last, and the value that they have to society. And then the third layer is the upper tier, the person overseeing the human defense against the alien invasion and the alien leading the invasion, sending out troops one at a time. It's a fantastic read, definitely worth checking out. What else is there? Another good example of the difference between science fiction and fantasy as far as content of purpose goes is a lot of things that are complex or difficult get a hand wave for the most part. A good example of that, again, going back to Star Wars, is the language barrier. C-3PO is supposed to be a communications droid, a protocol droid. He knows, hundreds of languages and can communicate in all of them. But for the most part, everybody understands everybody else, even though they're all speaking different languages, Han Solo has no problem speaking with Jabba the Hutt or Chewbacca or R2-D2, even though they each speak completely different languages. And the audience has no idea what's being said because, Jabba has some sort of weird, gravelly, guttural language. Wookiees just kind of scream, and R2-D2, the droid language is just clicks and whistles. But everybody understands it anyway. There's no difficulty in understanding other foreign languages, with the exception of the Ewoks, and C-3PO just translates for them without any kind of challenge to that either. It's just kind of hand-waved away. When the language barrier is something that can be incredibly huge. A good example of that would be the Foreigner series by C.J. Cherryh, who writes a story where the main character is a human translator on an alien planet within an alien society. And, the species is physically fairly similar to humans, but on a larger scale. There are a few biological differences, but the real big difference is psychological, and it addresses that constantly. Stuff like the alien species doesn't have a word or concept for love. They have instead this drive called Manchi, which is something between loyalty and the drive to follow the leader. Think like geese flying in a V formation, except as a constant. The entire species functions under that, and the entire ecosystem functions like that. The non-sapient species have a similar drive because they evolved very differently than the way that Earth species did. And instead of just kind of hand-waving away the language differences, Cherryh explores them phenomenally. I think I mentioned Solo and Vader's swaps already. I mentioned that I've already given this rant once today, right? Just screwed up and took a photo instead of a video recording. So this is take 2. The last bit is I've mentioned Star Wars a handful of times as a science fiction setting with a fantasy content of purpose. The reverse is a lot more rare, but it does exist sometimes. The best example that I have, that I've thought of, or that I did think of, have thought of, whatever, is the Goblin Slayer manga and anime. It's a satire of the kind of Dungeons and Dragons type story settings and an exploration of them, which is fascinating. It's very interesting. It's a lot of fun to read. But it boils down the genre. It's a Dungeons and Dragons type story, right? So sword and sorcery, but it boils things down to the point where everyone is kind of a caricature of a type of character. The main character is Goblin Slayer. He slays goblins. That's what he does. And every other character in the series, their name is a title of what they do, who they are. The elf archer, the dwarf monk, the lizard man priest, or the lizard man shaman, the priestess, the cowgirl, dairy farmer. Very straightforward names. Why? Because the entire thing is to explore the reason for the lowest level encounters in these things. You know, everybody knows that when you're starting out, the first thing you do is fight goblins. You know, but as you get more powerful, you move on to more powerful enemies and go off to fight, you know, the invading demon king or, you know, other more powerful enemies. But there are still goblins around. Why didn't you go back to fighting goblins? They never went away. The problem's still there. Goblin Slayer, as powerful as he has become, and he's, you know, like a silver rank adventurer, which is, you know, one step from the top, blah, 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 just fights goblins, hunts goblins, fights them. There's a demon lord off in the distance, you know, starting to try and take over the world. Is he a goblin? No, don't care. Killing goblins now. He is single-minded in his obsession with killing goblins. But the thing that makes the Goblin Slayer series have a science fiction content to it, that philosophical side of it, is they explore why goblins are the enemy. Not, you know, oh, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. But why are they the bad guys? You know, what is it about these creatures that makes it so that even though they know if they cause trouble, they're going to be hunted down and wiped out, they keep coming back. They keep attacking. They keep stirring up shit and being destroyed because of it. Why is that? And it's a fascinating exploration of the concept. And it's also interesting because they look at how the other adventurers treat goblins as a threat. You know, because all of the high-level adventurers were low-level adventurers at some point, and they all fought goblins at one point. You know, even though they've moved on to bigger and better things, they still remember. And it turns out that, you know, many of them still fear fighting goblins, even though they're so much more powerful than they were when they were doing that job, because of what goblins are, because of how goblins are, and why goblins are. It's fascinating. It's an amazing little story, and if you have the ability to read it, it's definitely worth reading or watching. I've mentioned before, you know, the purpose of these rants is for me to be able to kind of condense, consolidate, and congeal my thoughts on certain subjects so that I am more capable of coherently establishing them. This is exactly part of that. This is me doing that. And, secondary purpose is to make this interesting enough that someone listening to me ramble like an idiot for 40 minutes? Damn it. For 40 minutes about, the difference between science fiction and fantasy. Hopefully you're entertained. If you're still here, you are either entertained or you are a masochist, or both. I'm not here to judge. So hopefully you learned something, found something interesting, found something you agree with, disagree with, either way. If you disagree or agree, feel free to leave a comment about it. If I gave you something to think about, feel free to leave a comment about it. Just to reinforce what I have been talking about, I'm going to repeat the stories that I have kind of shilled here. Not really shilled, but talked about, brought up. Maybe the stories were interesting enough that you would be interested in them. And if you pick them up, read them, watch them, whatever, listen to them, if you do audiobooks, then that's a win for me too, whether you enjoyed what I was talking about or not. I'm not shilling Star Trek or Star Wars or Superman. Everybody knows, and everybody who has any interest in reading more or watching more of those knows how to check those out, because, come on now, Star Wars has been out since the 70s, Star Trek's been out since the 60s, Superman's been out for 100 years. The other stories that I talked about, Time Enough for Love by Robert Heinlein, The Chronicles of Jonathan Tibbs by T. Ellery Hodges. Yes, I remembered it. I couldn't remember it the first time I ran through the rant. And then when I realized that I hadn't actually recorded it at all because I'm an idiot, I started the rant back up without going back and checking. T. Ellery Hodges, Chronicles of Jonathan Tibbs, starting with the Never Hero. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely worth reading or listening to. If there is any justice in the world, the Chronicles of Jonathan Tibbs will be one of the few stories written during my lifetime that will go on and continue to influence people well past the time where I have died. T. Ellery Hodges is brilliant. If he never writes another thing again, his story will be worth remembering. And then Goblin Slayer, anime, manga. I don't remember the author or the production team, which is another thing that I would have looked up had I been thinking about it. Oh well. Goblin Slayer, it's big enough that if you type in Goblin Slayer, it'll pop up. You'll probably even find it abridged if you're still on YouTube when you're looking. Also good, interesting, leaves you things to think about. Anything else? I don't think so. I'm probably past the 45-minute marker. 12 seconds. Yeah. 10, 9, 8, Bob out.